moment from the past. Little Estela. In the center of a Portuguese town, houses on both sides of the streets stood so close to each other that neighbors could shake hands over the pavement without leaving their homes. There was always little light here, but these two girls knew a place where the sun shone brightly all day. It was there, at the intersection of two narrow streets, under the canopy of a spreading sycamore tree, that they were sitting. One of them was saying something and rocking a rag doll in her arms. The other girl also had a doll in her hands, making it walk along the ground. Each toy was made of the same fabric from which its owner's dresses were sewn. One, multicolored, was sewn from small pieces of fine foreign-made fabric. The other, a dingy drab gray, was made from a piece of unbleached wool. The first doll was always clean because dirt simply did not cling to it. The second kept traces of all the tumbles onto the ground and into puddles. A tall, burly woman came around the corner, a basket hanging from her half-bent arm. Passing by the girls, she broke into a smile.
"Good afternoon, Señorita Marissa,"
she said. The woman took out a pie from the basket, golden brown, lush, with streaks of jam, already hardened on the underside. She handed it to the girl in the brightly colored dress and, smiling once more, went on.
"Say hello to your mother,"
she shouted as a farewell. The girl brought the pie up to her mouth but changed her mind. She broke it in two and handed the smaller half to her friend. They both began to eat heartily. A little later, another woman appeared on the otherwise deserted street. She also carried a basket, but her burden was much heavier than a basket of pies. It was obvious from the face and gait of this young woman that she was very tired, and it was still early. The sun had not even reached its zenith. The girl in the gray dress jumped up and rushed to meet her.
"Mom, Mom!"
She grabbed the handle of the basket and pulled it towards her.
"Don't take it, dear,"
the mother said.
"You can't carry it, it's heavy."
"Mom, why was Marissa given a pie and I wasn't?"
the girl asked, sincerely puzzled.
"Because Marissa's father is a lieutenant general."
Her mother replied with barely noticeable sadness.
"And Marissa is also wearing a beautiful dress. Your dad is a simple captain and is far across the sea in Africa. However, if he returns victorious, he will be promoted, and you will no longer be the daughter of a simple captain."
The mother smiled and kissed the girl.
"In the meantime, come along, Estela. You can help me do the laundry."
The girl sighed and, looking back at her friend, waved her hand. Mother and daughter walked side by side.
"Do you really need a beautiful and expensive dress to be fed with sweet pies?"
The girl thought with resentment.
"Mom, will you make me a new dress?"
she asked.
"Of course."
The mother immediately replied.
"If your dad defeats his enemies, the king will reward him handsomely. Then Dad will buy us as many beautiful fabrics as he wants, and I'll make new dresses for both of us."
She shifted the laundry basket to her other arm and, unnoticed by her daughter, wiped her tears. Chapter 2. The Scarlet Ribbon. On the afternoon of May 20th, 1483, Leandro hosted guests at his Sinta estate. Sometimes it happened that the table in the dining room of his house was full of fried pheasants and partridges, jugs of wine and cider, pates, and dishes with pieces of roast beef, lamb, and stewed vegetables. A huge farm with fields, orchards, vineyards, and homes of peasants who regularly paid rent or worked on the estate provided everything that the owner and his family needed, but lavish feasts in the manor house rarely happened. As a rule, they only occurred on those days when Leandro's guests were not those closest to him. Today, the usual family dinner was being held at Leandro's house, and apart from the household, there was only Estela, daughter of the Castellan of the fortress of Leiria, and Senhor Bianco, the new assistant to the Venetian envoy. Senhor Bianco said he specifically wanted to visit Don Leandro at his estate, so he could expand his knowledge of Portugal in a relaxed atmosphere. Contrary to the custom at large feasts, women did not occupy a separate part of the table but sat mixed with men. Estela was sitting next to Leandro's son, Nuno. Nuno could only see the girl's dazzling beauty in profile. It was pleasant because Estela's face had one flaw, a deep wrinkle that ran through her forehead. In Nuno's imagination, this wrinkle never appeared, but every time he looked at Estela's face, the slight imperfection surprised him as if he were seeing it for the first time. From this angle, he couldn't see this blemish. Nuno and Estela were the same age. Both were 17. Many years ago, a jousting tournament was held in the fortress of Leiria, which gathered all the surrounding nobility including Leandro and his family. After the tournament, Daniel, Estela's father, the Castellan of the fortress, invited his wealthy neighbor, the landowner Don Leandro, to a feast. Manuella, Nuno's mother, and Carmina, Estela's mother, met at this gathering and, having children of the same age, found they had much in common to talk about. Moreover, their children immediately started chatting with each other as if they had been friends for many years. Neither the destiny of Estela nor Nuno had yet been truly decided, and these destinies were developing quite strangely. The other children born to Daniel and Carmina had all died one after the other. Estela was the only child who survived, and her parents loved her unceasingly. Estela, as a child, would often play with the toys of her deceased brothers and sisters, weathered tops and worn dolls. She adored them all the same. Daniel had no choice. He needed an heir, so he raised Estela like a boy. He carried her on his saddle, took her hunting, and put her next to him at feasts. The strange mark on Estela's forehead was a mystery to her mother, but Daniel remembered well. In just one evening, Estela's character had changed forever. It happened after he ordered her to slaughter a wounded baby deer. In the morning, Estela woke up with this wrinkle and a look completely unfamiliar to her father. After Daniel's distinguished fighting in the Battle of Estela, Morocco, in 1471, the king awarded him by making him Castellan of the fortress of Leiria and its environs. The fortress, which stood only a day's gallop from Lisbon, guarded one of the central districts of Portugal. In the 12 years following, he spared no expense for teachers and tutors for his daughter, and Estela grew up an intelligent, inquisitive girl with a strong character. Eventually, Estela, with the help of the king, became the first Portuguese woman to attend university. At the university, she inevitably turned out to be the most resourceful in academic debates, the most knowledgeable book reader, and the most astute natural scientist. Leandro treated Estela with a level of respect that a woman of that century was rarely afforded by men, and not just because she was Daniel's daughter. He and Don Leandro were not friends, and although Leandro still had a little respect for the famous soldier, he disliked his constant readiness to fulfill any order of the king. However, Estela was a completely different and internally independent human being. In Leandro's spacious house, which Estela visited from time to time, there was even a special room for her, and on the occasions when she came to his estate, sometimes with her mother, sometimes with servants, and in recent years alone, he was always amazed to see how she flourished. And each time he was surprised and delighted by the growth and strength of her character. One day, Estela, who was about 12 years old at the time, came with her mother to visit Leandro's family. The owner himself had left for Lisbon for business. Nuno and Estela went for a walk around the estate, and the girl noticed that the foresters had left harvested logs, intended for the construction of a new forge, right on the ground. Estela knew that the forge was to be built the next season. She ran and caught up with the foresters' wagon train and forced them to go back and stack the logs properly on the baseboards, and so that their ends were facing the wind, which typically blew from the direction of the field. If the logs were left lying on the ground, they would quickly begin to rot. Such attention to detail was unusually astute for a 12-year-old girl. Leandro greatly appreciated Estela's quick action, and from that time, he always heeded what Estela brought to his attention when she came to visit his estate. As for the son of Leandro, his world was vastly different. He also grew up a favorite of his parents. However, they were completely different from Estela's father and mother. Nuno was allowed to bask in bed in the morning, and water was warmed for the whole house in the mornings just for him alone. His life was spent in dovecots, fields, and groves, where he and Luis, his childhood mentor, studied the habits of various forest and field creatures. On rainy days, Nuno usually played dice and other games with Luis, listened to his stories, or sat reading a book from his parents' rich library. Nuno had a clear gift for painting. He was especially adept at depictions of animals. His father, finding his son's sketches in the margins of books, sighed, vexed, but at the same time he admired them. No matter what Nuno grew up to be, it was already clear that he would be good at everything. It was just the waiting, perhaps another year, no more. His parents believed firmly that childhood should be lived to the fullest. In the meantime, let him read books about giants and monsters, about travel and adventures. No one has ever gotten worse from reading books. However, it cannot be said that Nuno plunged into his boyish amusements and books too deeply and irrevocably. He would also spend hours hanging around the blacksmiths, carpenters, or craftsmen who worked around the estate, helping them, finding some work for himself, or even replacing the occasional novice worker. He was good at crafts and in all the occupations that required skilled hands. Sometimes peasants and artisans invited Nuno to lunch, and he ate lentil soup from a common bowl hungrily and broke off pieces of bread from a single large loaf. For this, he was repeatedly reprimanded by his mother. She did not trust the cleanliness of the peasants. Besides, after such meals, Nuno ate little at family dinners, which also upset her. Nuno grew up a kind boy, maybe too kind. Manuella, his mother, even once had a nightmare that Nuno became a monk, after which she kept checking on Nuno's adventures with suspicion in regard to his future. On this afternoon, Manuela was sitting at the table directly opposite Nuno and, as usual, trying to imagine the fate of her son. From time to time Estela said something to Nuno and pressed her lips to her cup. Manuela noticed that Estela carefully examined a piece of cheese in the dish in front of her and crumpled it with her fingers. Manuela was not at all surprised by this, and even more so she was not offended by Estela's attitude to the treat. She was well aware of the young lady's upbringing, and this attentiveness to quality made her so different from Nuno. Leandro behaved exactly the same as Estela since he knew well the value of the dishes that were on his table. The house musician, who was sitting in the corner of the dining room and leisurely plucking a lute, suddenly left the strings alone and coughed. Leandro's voice became clearly audible. He told Senhor Bianco,
"You see, mio caro, our country is in many ways similar to the Republic of St. Mark. The Doge of Venice has enormous powers, and yet he is not omnipotent. The Doge takes into account the opinion of the Grand Council. Everyone remembers that Doge Marino Faliero paid with his life when he went against the elected statesman. Our king, may the Lord grant him many summers, is very similar in his ways."
After drinking wine, the usually stern Leandro began to relax and did not notice that his voice was getting louder.
"The Cortes is the name of our assembly of representatives from the nobility, clergy, and citizens."
Leandro continued,
"They can submit proposals, requests, or complaints to the king. Sometimes the Cortes even hands a paper directly to the king with a ready-made decree he can read and sign. Here, the right of the king remains exclusive. He may, by his sole decision, accept the decree or reject it, and then the Cortes may have to ease their proposal so that the king approves it."
Leandro kept silent about the fact that the current king had ceased to reckon with the Cortes.
"The government of your kingdom has employed the best features and policies of the republics of antiquity, Don Leandro,"
Bianco said. He arrived in Portugal quite recently but already spoke Portuguese well.
"But what about nobles? Do the aristocrats find a common language with merchants and act together?"
Tell it straight, Leandro.
Manuela said.
We are not some Arabian army on a campaign circling around in the desert. In our country, as in Venice, among not only nobles but also merchants and priests, there are people who can directly petition the king about the needs of their estates.
That's right.
Leandro slammed his fist on the table emphatically.
The support of the king is primarily given to the military, merchants, peasants, and clergy. The nobles, who, as is commonly believed, owe everything to the royal throne, are more likely to be in opposition to the king, but all of the estates make up the Cortes.
Don Leandro is part of the Cortes.
Manuela continued, looking at Bianco with a smile.
He is a representative of the nobles, although the nobles consider him first a friend of the people, and only then a servant of the king.
Leandro nodded grimly. Even his wife had little idea to what extent the new king was neglecting the old way of government in the country. The king did not want to hear the voice of the people, believing that he knew their needs better than the Cortes. He just spat on them, sawing off the branch on which he was sitting. Nuno did not participate at all in this conversation or any of the like. He cared little about state affairs. Sometimes he wanted to ask his father to stop worrying so much and consider that he himself might be wrong. The king couldn't have acted so rashly if so many were on his side. But of course, Nuno couldn't afford to say that out loud. Suddenly, he felt Duarte's cold nose nuzzling his knee. The big dog, who faithfully accompanied Nuno outside the house, was lying under the table and clearly bored. Nuno lowered his hand, and his palm was immediately moistened by the dog's warm tongue. The huge, gate-like entrance doors creaked. Francisco, the steward of the house and estate, entered the hall. After making a slight bow to the assembled guests, he walked over to Leandro and, bending his head, said something quietly.
What?
Leandro cut him off mid-sentence.
Speak your report aloud.
Yes, Don Leandro.
Francisco obeyed.
News just arrived from the settlement by the sea. A dead man was found there, right on the seashore.
Oh!
Manuela exclaimed.
A peasant? From the fortress? A sailor?
Leandro asked with surprise but remained calm.
So far no one has recognized him. They only said that he was young and simply dressed. He looks like a soldier, although he did not have a weapon with him.
Estela raised her cup to her lips, took a sip, and calmly asked Nuno.
Well, shall we examine the find? You seem to know all the local dogs and boys, don't you?
Won't you be scared?
Nuno asked apprehensively.
I must admit, I don't like dead people.
It's time to get used to it.
Stella said.
Times are restless these days.
She turned her attention to Leandro.
Don Leandro. You won't mind if Nuno and I go, will you? We can inspect everything and report back to you when we return.
Go ahead.
Leandro agreed.
Just take someone with you. Take Luis.
Estela and Nuno were approaching the stable. There, Francisco's son Raul, together with Luis, were already saddling horses. In one hand, Nuno held a bow, and with the other, he adjusted the strap on which hung a quiver with arrows. Duarte wagged his tail and romped in circles around his owner. Luis gave Nuno the reins of the bay horse, and the boy jumped into the saddle in one fell swoop and looked at Estela. She put her foot in the stirrup and pushed away Raul's hand as he was trying to help her. The moment Estela jumped up on the horse, her beautiful blue dress outlined, for a brief moment, the shape of a girl's body in all its hidden beauty. Nuno's breath caught in his throat.
You can spot good horse owners right away.
Estela said, stroking the head of her white mare.
No iron in the bridle.
A minute later, Luis led the horse he had saddled for himself out of the stable, and the riders started off. Estela's shock of luxurious flaxen hair trembled in time with the light trot of her mare. Luis brought up the rear. The road began to descend, and Estela looked back at the house they had just left. It was a solid two-story pink house. Perhaps it could even be called a palace since it included several buildings adjacent to each other. The huge windows, with jagged borders on the edge of the roofs, seemed to resemble fortress walls. The house, surrounded by a variety of trees and bushes, stood on a raised platform, which was surrounded by a high border of rough stone that also resembled a part of a fortress. However, inside everything was quite peaceful. The rich decoration, starting with the spacious, carpeted staircase leading to the second floor, was often the subject of Leandro's obsessive worries. He had suffered much since his youth as his parents' house fell into disrepair following the death of his mother. Estela thought of her own childhood home with sadness and distaste. Life within a fortress can also leave a military imprint on the dwelling of the Castellan, which Estela's mother tried to manage. There were damp walls, dusty carpets, a disgusting smell from the street where both horses and soldiers defecated with equal ease, and the inescapable smell of dinner cooked for 200 people at once. Of course, when her father became a Castellan, they moved to a house outside the walls of the fortress. But even that house was a doghouse compared to Don Leandro's mansion, and to her kennel she would have to return. Nuno and Estela rode along the forest road, each on a different side of the tracks left by the wheels of peasant carts and manor carriages. From time to time, they had to bend down to avoid a branch of a spreading oak. The 2.5 leagues separating the estate from the seashore were already coming to an end, but the forest through which they were traveling was still quite dense. Life triumphed in its depths. Birds were singing with might and main, the hubbub drowned out by Duarte's barking now and then. The flowering branches had already shed their white, carmine, and yellow petals, and in some places, pistils could be distinguished on them. The forest consisted primarily of thickets of cork oak with almost no undergrowth. In some places, among the oaks, one could see lonely juniper bushes, from a distance looking like travelers wrapped in cloaks, frozen. Among the customs of the local peasants was the rule: collect the stones of eaten plums, oranges, apples, olives, and other fruits, and then scatter them in suitable places. Therefore, fruit trees also found places for themselves among the oaks, and by how often they were seen, travelers could judge how close they were to human habitation. Suddenly the way of the riders was crossed by a red flash of a fox rushing at full speed. Duarte followed her out from under the canopy of the forest. A moment later, the dog disappeared into the thickets on the right side of the road in pursuit. Duarte, spoiled today with leftovers from the master's table, was not in a hurry. He didn't even have enough desire to hunt or bark. From the thickets came only a lazy, low-voiced growl that echoed deep into the forest. It seemed that the appearance of the fox offended Duarte more than it humored him. Estela, assessing the situation, asked casually,
Nuno, why aren't you hunting? You have a bow and arrows.
Nuno looked at Estela's beautiful, sculpted face and shrugged. He had a hunch about where this conversation was going.
I don't really like hunting.
Then why do you need a bow?
My father says that sooner or later I will need it, that I should master the art of war.
Nuno mused, and then continued in a more joking tone.
Besides, we're not going on holiday. In the forest, you know, it's not always peaceful. Estela, you seem to have lost your sense of it while in Lisbon.
And what art of war have you already mastered?
With a sling.
Nuno really had learned how to throw stones with a sling. He had already hit the target at 100 or more paces. The skill came naturally. He just had to throw stones as often as possible and, at the same time, keep in mind the feat of David, who struck the giant Goliath.
They say you hit yourself last week, Nuno? Is it true?
Nuno laughed. He knew who would have told Estela about this.
Yes. The stone fell out of the sling and hit me in the leg.
Did it hurt?
Not really. No more painful than a hammer blow on a finger in the workshop.
Nuno continued to laugh.
And that's why you decided to change your sling for a bow and arrows?
No, my father says that I will need to master this weapon as well, and I want to learn to do it on my own. Here, look.
Nuno took an arrow from his quiver, knocked it on the bowstring, pulled back, and shot at the remains of a huge, barkless oak tree that could be seen in the depths of the forest. The arrow pierced right into the middle of the trunk at the height of a man. Luis rode unhurriedly to the oak tree to retrieve the arrow.
Bravo.
Estela said calmly.
But you know, if you're going to command a regiment of archers, you probably won't need this skill. Don't you want to learn how to command? Or build fortresses? Or both? My father could help you master those arts.
I don't want to.
Nuno muttered.
And in general, I like the peaceful life on the estate. Not war.
It wasn't that he didn't like studying, it was just that Nuno was interested in completely different things in his studies, and as for the art of war, he did not want to be a soldier at all. Shooting a bow at a tree is one thing, but shooting an arrow at a person or even an animal is quite another. A quiet life, where there was no need to even think about such things, suited him perfectly.
And I don't like the countryside,
Estela said. However, she immediately secretly admitted to herself that Nuno's estate was different, and she really liked staying there. She stood up in the stirrups and straightened the folds of her dress.
I am interested in studying and learning. Do you understand? And you can only study at a university in Lisbon. I enjoy talking to smart people. Village life makes people stupid. Even the smart ones.
And what do they say in Lisbon?
Our navigators have returned from a long voyage to Africa. Many hope that soon merchants will begin to carry black slaves and gold from there. Perhaps some of the new slaves will soon be working in your fields.
Estela looked ahead. Nuno gazed at her as she spoke. She had the visage of the marble Aphrodite standing in the hallway at his father's house. Alluring lines reached from the outer corners of her blue eyes almost to her temples.
Are you really interested in all this, Estela?
Something else surprises me, Nuno. Why aren't you interested in this? You're so smart. So talented. You draw beautifully, shoot accurately. You have no equal in chess.
He just laughed.
Well, you beat me twice.
He was glad to end the conversation as they approached the seaside.
It seems we're getting to the place.
From afar, the muffled roar of the surf could be heard.
There's a cliff already visible.
Luis interrupted their conversation, pointing forward with an arrow he grasped in the middle.
What do you think happened there?
Nuno asked him.
A drunken fight. It must have been.
Luis shrugged, giving the arrow to Nuno.
Maybe over some girl. Maybe they fought over a debt. Sometimes they fight without any reason, out of boredom.
As soon as the riders left the forest, a salty sea wind hit their faces. At the top of the coastal cliff, they saw a crowd of people. Even from this distance, it was clear it was the locals, peasants and fishermen from the nearest village. Grimly, without looking into the faces of the riders, people began to move to allow Nuno, Estela, and Luis space to pass through. Along the road that ran near the shore, lonely merchants drove their donkeys and nags. They rode around the crowd of dirty peasants, trying not to look at them. Just off the road, a dead man lay face down, partially obscured by the crowd of villagers. Two saddled horses stood nearby, grazing as if nothing had happened, the grass surprisingly thick and lush for a rocky peak. Nuno and Estela rode up to the crowd where it had parted, and the riders dismounted.
Turn him over!
Estela ordered imperiously. The dead man was turned over. Looking into the mirrors that decorated the manor house in Sinta, one could not see oneself well. The quality of even the most famous and well-made Venetian mirrors was too low at that time, and yet Nuno was familiar enough with his own reflection. He realized that the dead man looked much like him, with the same boyish face, the same youthful figure, and slightly above average height. Even the clothes were the same, a dark leather sleeveless top over a white shirt and black pants tucked into dark boots. There was a spot of dried blood on the dead man's right sleeve. His unnaturally twisted neck was surrounded by a dark blue bruise. Nuno had never thought about death before. The concept itself seemed far away from him, but as he now contemplated, here it was, death, right in front of his face. This young man could easily have been himself, and no one would have asked him if he was ready to die. The realization of this scared him the most.
Has he been identified?
Estela asked and once again examined the villagers around her with her sharp gaze. The crowd was silent. The men looked at Estela from under their brows, her beautiful dress and white face. Hardly any of them had seen such a beauty before. Villages were not rich with beautiful women, and by the age of Estela, beauty would have already faded, their faces dark from the sun, lined with worry and the boorishness of their husbands.
Can anyone tell me what kind of person this could be?
Estela raised her voice.
Are these his horses? Why are there two of them? Where is the second rider?
The crowd pushed a strange little man in a torn shirt with the sleeves rolled up to Estela and Nuno. There was a smile on his face, either drunk or insane.
Maybe he knows.
Someone in the crowd said.
Come on, Augustine, say something.
It seems like there were two of them, Your Grace.
The peasant said in a raspy voice.
I've seen them both on horseback. They rode along the coast. Then, they came up here, but then I didn't really look.
Where did the second one go?
Estela asked.
Maybe someone in the village or on the road saw a stranger.
The crowd was silent. The village fool, Augustine, was still grinning with a toothless mouth.
Luis,
Nuno called.
Have you seen this man before?
I won't say so directly what I saw or didn't see,
said Luis.
I don't look at faces, they all lie. But his shoes seem familiar to me. One craftsman makes such boots in the fortress in Leiria. He stitches along the sole with a red thread with just such a special design. It requires a special talent. It is red and not faded yet. I am not mistaken. I used to wear boots like this myself once. That cobbler made these boots. They are from there, that's for sure.
Cristiano!
Nuno suddenly exclaimed. He stepped closer to the body of the deceased and shouted again as if he wanted to wake a sleeper.
Cristiano!
Duarte, who finally came running out of the forest, raised his muzzle to the sky and howled.
I remember him. This is Cristiano. God, how he's grown.
Who's Cristiano?
Estela asked.
I knew him as a child.
Continued Nuno.
He taught me to sail a boat against the wind near Villa de Porto. How could I have forgotten him? 5 years have passed. But he was already a real sailor then. And the son of a sailor, it must be.
Nuno couldn't believe how suddenly death could overtake someone he knew. Once upon a time, he and this man chatted and laughed carelessly together. How could something so terrible happen to someone so young? It seemed unnatural. Estela was silent. Luis shrugged and sighed. There was nothing they could do. Or could they?
Luis, go to the village and bring someone from the undertaker.
Nuno said, recovering from the shock. Luis picked up the reins of his horse but then dropped them, waved his hand, and began to descend to the plain.
I really need to wash my face,
Estela said, tired of the road and the weight of what was happening.
Let's go down to the sea.
Nuno didn't mind. He needed to quell his anxiety. Fortunately, the shore was quiet and completely deserted. The lava, once cooled, was piled up here in a solid wall, as if skilled masons created even layers of the same thickness. Where the lava gave way to the sea, the shore was intricately drawn into squares. The gaps between these black squares, some regular, some slightly oval, were covered with light sand, and therefore the shore below the cliff resembled the back of a giant turtle. Estela filled her palms with water, splashed it on her face, sighed, and looked at the sun, and then at Nuno. Something in her face changed when she looked at him. Her flaxen hair reflected the rays of light, and her blue eyes were thoughtful. It seemed as if the edge of this shore of inexpressible beauty, the sea wind, and some sense of freedom were calling her somewhere. Unexpectedly, even for herself, Estela said everything she had wanted to say for a long time.
Nuno, your eyes reflect the sea and the sky. Over the years, they will become this color.
Estela pointed to a block of dark blue basalt that emerged from the black lava.
Like your father. And your beard will grow the same as well, like Don Leandro or the Assyrian king. Your shoulders are already as wide now. Do you know what wise women say about people like you? People like you always have beautiful children. What would you call your son, Nuno?
Nuno looked at Estela with surprise, even with fright. He had not expected such a conversation at all. They both looked at each other in silence. Estela's gaze was full of tenderness and love. It was as if she was waiting for something from Nuno, but he was no longer paying attention to her, peering at something behind her.
What is that? Look!
Estela turned around to look where Nuno pointed. Something was waving from a huge, half-submerged snag. On one of its appendages hung a surprisingly bright scarlet ribbon. Estela waded out to the snag, took off the ribbon, and examined it.
Nuno, look. What is it?
Nuno looked at the ribbon with interest. Estela squeezed the material between her fingers and rubbed it.
I've never held such a cloth in my hands before, Nuno. This is not usual fabric, maybe from overseas. Look.
Estela stretched the ribbon and held it in front of Nuno. The entire length of the ribbon was embroidered with images of human figures with animal heads in bizarre poses. Estela turned the band over and showed it to Nuno again. There were also strange signs on the reverse side, 1 line and 4 dots. He had never seen anything like it before. Overseas merchants sometimes passed through their parts, but not recently. Nuno shrugged thoughtfully and looked around.
I don't understand either. People rarely come here. Perhaps the poor man up on the cliff dropped it?
Estelle said nothing. She tucked the ribbon into the sleeve of her dress and looked around. Neither she nor Nuno noticed anything unusual on the shore. Only clumps of algae and half-submerged, water-blackened fragments of a tree. The young pair went back up to the plain. There they saw that Luis and a gloomy-looking man, who was pulling a small handcart, were already approaching the edge of the cliff. Together they carried the deceased to the cart, and the undertaker, glancing at Nuno and Estela with a gloomy look, pulled the cart back toward the village. Nuno and Estela followed them in silence. The villagers knew Nuno well, as he was the son of the owner of the local lands. In addition, curiosity and passion for mastering crafts repeatedly brought the young man to their homes and workshops. Even as a very young boy, Nuno wandered into many of these places every now and then. Questioning these people did not clarify much. Apart from Augustine, no one else saw the riders, one of whom was found dead. The most recent of the peasants questioned by Nuno and Estela said that the poor man must have served in the fortress of Leiria. The villager saw him driving on Sundays along the road that leads from the fortress to the port town of Vila de Porto because his family lived there. On the way back to the estate, Nuno hardly spoke to either Estela or Luis. He still couldn't get the expression on the dead face of Cristiano out of his head. A simple man he once knew. Something in the whole situation would not give him peace and would not allow him to be distracted. In the end, he decided that he would definitely find the man's family and try to help them in some way, and informed Estela about it.
When I get home, I'll go straight to the market and ask the people there. Maybe someone knew this Cristiano.
Estela said.
From the gossip in city markets, you can almost always find answers.
Luis had managed to get some wine somewhere. Now he was trudging behind the young people, and from time to time took out a clay flask from his bosom, gurgled something, and then continued the story that he had begun at the edge of the forest.
So, the old people say that this is the work of the Red Ghost. He wanders along the seashore and the surrounding groves. He's been wandering for a long time. Some old people saw him as a child. He is red because he drinks blood.
Estela and Nuno exchanged silent smiles. Meanwhile, the sun was sinking into the sea. It became noticeably darker in the forest. In the bag strapped to Luis's saddle, there were prepared torches in case it became completely dark. Estela, hearing Luis's constant hiccups following the sloshing in his flask, giggled nonchalantly, throwing her head back and closing her eyes.
And now this red ghost is wandering around wherever he wants. And they sanctified these places and sprinkled holy water, but all to no avail. Every year, there will inevitably be a dead man, or he will plague the cows, or the donkeys will go berserk. He introduced himself to one widow as a poor traveler, and afterward, she was found in bed without a single drop of blood in her body. In one word, Red Ghost.
With these words, Luis crashed to the ground. Duarte barked deafeningly. Nuno immediately jumped off his horse and ran up to Luis. Grabbing the old man by the collar, he began to lift him up. Luis suddenly shouted,
"Come on. Nothing will happen to me, Nuno. I was once thrown from the fortress wall. I don't care about anything since then."
Estela kept laughing louder with her silver laugh. A little later, lights appeared in the depths of the forest, followed by the sound of a horse trampling through the underbrush. A minute later, Raul rode up to Nuno and Estela, holding a torch over high.
"Are you okay? Donna Manuella asked me to search for you,"
Raul informed them. When Nuno and Estela returned, joining the family at supper, they saw that the former guests, as well as new people, including the housekeeper, the steward, and Nuno's tutors, were all sitting at the table next to Leandro and Senhor Bianco. Everyone had already had supper and, judging by their high spirits, even walked to the winery, which was located just behind the vineyard, no more than 100 steps from the stable. Leandro was telling the Venetian something, and the others looked from one to the other. From time to time, they agreed with the head of the family, or, interrupting each other, supplemented his dialogue with their own judgments. Senhor Bianco's smile never left his face. On the surface, it might seem that he was an important gentleman from the capital, who especially came to listen to the complaints and wishes of the provincials. The musician, sitting on a chair, was sleeping with a childish smile on his face, and no one even tried to wake him up. When the young duo entered, Manuella looked first at Estela, then at Nuno. She seemed a little upset. Leandro, at the sight of his son, put his hand on the hand of Senhor Bianco, who was answering something, and said sympathetically,
"Excuse me, senor." "Well, Nuno? What happened there?"
"We found a dead man."
Nuno replied.
"It was a man I knew as a kid. The villagers said he may have served at Leiria Castle."
"In any case, Don Daniel must be informed of this as soon as possible."
Leandro concluded.
"Not only could it be his soldier, but he also keeps order in our villages. Call for Francisco."
"I'm here, Your Grace."
The forgotten steward stepped out from behind Leandro's chair.
"Send a messenger. Send Raul to Leiria. Raul already knows everything, doesn't he? Have him tell them at the castle about what happened here."
"Yes, Don Leandro."
Having put an end to the matter, Leandro again turned to the Venetian.
"I'm sorry again. And allow me to object, the state system of the Republic of Venice seems to me more perfect than ours. Truly, no man is a prophet in his homeland, is he?"
Senhor Bianco nodded.
"Oh, yes. This tragedy is ubiquitous."
2 years ago, our glorious King Afonso died, and João II ascended the throne. I must say that the new king already had a good reputation by that time.
Absolutely right.
Manuela nodded.
By that time, João II had already become famous not only at jousting tournaments and in battles, but also as a patron of the arts, sciences, and navigation.
And Fernando II de Braganza, 3 years earlier, had inherited immense wealth and all titles from his late father. His family was the largest ruling family in the kingdom. The Duke himself already earned the same privileges as the greatest of the king's generals. He accompanied King Afonso on overseas military campaigns and distinguished himself there more than once. There the Duke fought hand in hand with the royal heir, João II.
Suddenly, a goblet fell from the tray in the maid's hands, followed by other empty dishes. She shrieked, apologized from the bottom of her heart to the gentleman, and began to pick up the dishes from the floor. Leandro was not surprised. She showed such carelessness at least once a month.
Well, Senor, the Duke of Braganza has become the most venerated leader of the nobility. They strive to preserve the influence and wealth received under the late king. I'll be honest, I myself am not only a friend of the Duke, but also his supporter in the field of public affairs. In my opinion, the collegial rule of different estates, whether nobles, clergy, or merchants, is much better than the undivided power of the monarch. Such rule contributes much more to the prosperity of the state and the people than sovereign rule. Isn't the power and wealth of your fatherland the most obvious example of this?
Thank you, Senor.
Bianco replied with a smile on his face.
The envoy will definitely hear about your sentiment towards both Duke de Braganza and the Republic of St. Mark.
However, the new king and his party hold different views,
Leandro said. He took a leisurely sip from the goblet and continued.
As soon as he ascended the throne, the king began to reconsider the grounds for the privileges of the great lords, which they had received from the late Afonso V and the previous monarchs. Needless to say, doesn't all of this cause worry for the nobles of the kingdom? Their families? Their distant relatives? Their household people and peasants? Isn't there a threat of unrest when the king encroaches on the estates of his nobles?
It's so good that there is the Cortes in Portugal, and you can freely discuss class claims there.
Senhor Bianco concluded sympathetically.
That's not quite true again,
Leandro said gloomily. He could have said that the king, perhaps, had completely forgotten that his subjects had the Cortes, but refrained and simply added with annoyance.
Close, but not so.
Everyone fell silent. Only Nuno and Estela, sitting at a distance from the guests, were whispering about something. They laughed from time to time. They were rolling with laughter, the kind that sometimes makes young people who are full of life laugh for no particular reason. Leandro, already quite tired of the conversation, looked at his son. Why do his father's affairs and worries concern his offspring so little? Time goes by, and one day Nuno will have to do what his father is doing now. Manage at least the estate, not to mention public affairs. As long as Leandro himself could remember, his life was spent in labor and worries. Leandro's mother died early, and his father, shocked by the death of his beloved wife, never fully recovered. He neglected his business and responsibilities, leaving everything in the care of the steward, and the estate began to decline. When his father died, Leandro was the same age as Nuno today. Having dismissed the steward, he himself zealously took on the duties. He got up at dawn and walked around the arable land, barnyards, orchards, and vineyards of his father's estate. Over time, Leandro realized that not only fields and pastures could bring profit. Portugal, a maritime power, was gaining strength and needed a fleet, both military and commercial. Soon wagons loaded with brackets for ship planks, hooks, and chains for ship equipment went from the forges Leandro built on his lands to Lisbon, Porto, and even to Castile. Leandro would return to his house after dark daily, and he still didn't have enough time to finish his business duties. Sometimes he had to spend several days inspecting remote holdings, and during these few days he was away, He always noticed things on the main estate began to go awry. In his opinion, only bad things were done, and the good things were never done. Leandro was not yet 30 when he was chosen to represent the local nobility in the Cortes. It happened after he met Duke de Braganza. The management of the farm again had to be trusted to someone else's hands, because now, Leandro spent all his free time drafting laws, traveling to the Cortes in Leiria, and countering inquiries from the king's party. However, there were other things going on in the Cortes in Leiria. Often Leandro helped landowners and merchants to achieve their own personal goals in the Cortes. Sometimes, with his help, they received new lands from the king or even titles of nobility. Leandro, who knew well the value of the labor and efforts of intermediaries in all kinds of cases, did not refuse remuneration, knowing full well he would benefit as well as the Cortes. Regardless, wasn't the power of the Cortes strengthened by new landowners or when the wealth of current landowners increased? But what about Nuno? Nuno did not want to grow up and did not want to listen to adult conversations. No matter how hard Leandro tried to imagine his son in his place, he could not. He was not cut out for such trials and did not seek to learn how to manage the economy. What would need to happen for him to change? Nuno had too soft a character to force lazy men and drunkards to honest work, punish poachers and village thieves, force men to marry defamed virgins, and properly support children and the elderly, and no amount of exercise would help in this matter. That's just how Nuno had grown up. He would never raise his hand against another person, just as no one had ever raised a hand against him. Leandro had never thought about the correctness of his upbringing, but now he couldn't help thinking, is Manuella right this time too? Can marriage really fix Nuno? And why not? With Estela, of course. To a strong-willed, smart, and probably kind girl such as Estela is. Who else could make a more worthy pair? Yes, but Estela's father is a supporter of the king, and who else knows how high the sprouts of the current civil strife, which he himself told Senhor Bianco today, can ascend.
Estela!
He suddenly had a realization.
You visit the capital more often than we do. Tell me, what do they say about the rivalry between the king and his nobility? And what do they say in Leiria?
The common people, Don Leandro, admire the new king.
Estela answered loudly, distracted from joking conversations with Nuno. There was still a hint of laughter in her voice.
They always rejoice when their masters are pressured by someone stronger, and everyone at the university is just crazy about the king. After all, Joao, even during Afonso's lifetime, strongly supported the local pundits. As for Leiria, you know my father. He is also pleased with the new king. And my father's subordinates support his opinion, as it should be for serving people. No matter what they think to themselves.
Her father is pleased with the king.
Leandro summed up in his mind. Not only were Leandro and Manuella concerned about Nuno's future that evening. Estela was thinking about him, too, about him and only him. In the calculus of the Al-Khwarizmi systems, she had far surpassed her fellow students. Her maths was better than anyone who was present in the dining room of Leandro's house that evening. She had long ago, with the help of her mother, assessed the condition of wealth together of both her father and Leandro. Turned out very well. As for her rank in society, high society, of course, because Estela could think of nothing less, she might be among the highest in the kingdom of Joao II. Her opportunity, that first kiss Estela had hoped to get from Nuno today, was so close, and some silly ribbon with stupid drawings prevented him. Well, she'll have to wait for another chance. An event after which an engagement would be inevitable. Of course, Estela's parents thought that she was wasting her time on trips to Don Leandro's estate. Her mother had told her straight out that Nuno would never marry her. But they still couldn't offer her anything suitable or better. Her only hope was to go toward her goal without looking back at her parents. Estela waited for Manuella to shake her head wearily once again and turn away from her husband. She caught Manuela's eye and smiled at her brightly, still flush with laughter, although perhaps a little melancholy. Manuela gave her a motherly smile back.